It wasn't the roar of the crowd that shattered him, not the weight of fame or the echo of sold-out stadiums. It was silence, and one song he'd buried for decades. Steve Perry, the voice that carried Journey to immortality, sat alone in a small studio. His finger hovered over the play button. 25 years had passed since he'd touched this melody. 25 years of running, hiding, avoiding the man he used to be. The first notes played. His chest tightened. By the second verse, tears blurred everything. This was the song that held every ghost, the woman he loved and lost, the fame that consumed him, the voice he abandoned. He'd spent half his life keeping this moment at bay. But at 69, there was nowhere left to run. What happened next would force him to face the heartbreak he'd carried in silence, the love that never really ended, the music that never really left. This isn't just about a comeback. It's about the one song that broke through everything Steve Perry built to protect himself. Stay with us, because what this song reveals will change how you hear his voice forever. The voice that changed everything. 1977 was the year rock music got its most powerful weapon. Journey was struggling with talented musicians with no real direction. They had the skills, but lacked something essential, a voice that could evoke emotions in people. Steve Perry walked into their world like lightning in a bottle. He wasn't from a fancy music school. He grew up in Hanford, California, surrounded by Motown records and gospel singers. His mother sang, his father sang, and music ran through his veins like blood. When he opened his mouth during that first audition, everything shifted. The band members looked at each other, stunned. This wasn't just singing. This was raw emotion wrapped in 4 octaves of pure power. Neil Schon, Journey's lead guitarist, later recalled that moment. We knew within 30 seconds. This was the voice we'd been searching for. The other members nodded in agreement, barely able to contain their excitement. They'd auditioned dozens of singers, but nobody came close to what Perry brought into that room. Journey's first album with Perry, Infinity, dropped in 1978. Songs like Wheel in the Sky and Lights weren't just hits. They were confessions. Perry sang every line like his life depended on it. Audiences didn't just listen. They believed every single word. The album sold over 1 million copies in its first year. Radio stations across America played their songs on repeat. MTV, still in its early days, featured its music videos constantly. Perry's face became recognizable everywhere he went. But success came with invisible chains. Every album demanded more. Every tour pulled him further from the person he used to be. The kid from California who just wanted to sing was slowly disappearing into the machine of fame. By 1979, Journey was touring 10 months out of the year. Perry barely saw his family. His friends from Hanford stopped calling because he was never available. The simple life he'd known, backyard barbecues, Sunday dinners, quiet evenings, had vanished completely. Perry became obsessed with getting things perfect. Bandmates watched him redo vocals 20, 30 times. Engineers sat in silence as he chased a sound only he could hear. One producer later said, Steve wouldn't stop until his voice matched the version in his head. The problem was that the version didn't exist. Recording sessions that should have taken 3 hours stretched into 12. The band would finish their parts and leave, but Perry stayed behind, alone with the engineer, trying one more take, then another, then another. His perfectionism became legendary in the industry. The pressure built quietly. Interviews, photo shoots, endless touring, each piece chipped away at something inside him. He smiled for the cameras, signed autographs, and played the role. But deep down, Perry was drowning in expectations nobody else could see. His voice became both his greatest gift and his heaviest burden. Fans expected perfection every single night. Critics analyzed every note. The band relied on him to deliver. And Perry felt the weight of all those expectations crushing down on his shoulders. Then came 1981. Journey released Escape. And suddenly, they weren't just big, they were massive. Don't Stop Believin' became more than a song. It became a cultural moment. Perry's voice was everywhere. Radios, TV commercials, movie soundtracks. The album sold over 9 million copies in the United States alone. It spent weeks at #1 on the Billboard charts. Journey was now one of the biggest bands in the world, selling out arenas in minutes. The woman behind the music. While Journey conquered the world, Steve Perry's heart belonged to one person, Sherry Swafford. She wasn't famous, wasn't chasing cameras or headlines. She was an esthetician living a quiet life in California, and that's exactly what Perry needed. They met in the early 1980s, and for the first time in years, Steve felt like himself around someone. Sherry saw past the rock star image. She knew the real man underneath the one who loved simple dinners, long conversations, and moments away from the chaos. Their relationship was beautiful but complicated. Perry was constantly gone. Tours lasted months. Recording sessions stretched into endless nights. Even when he was physically present, his mind was somewhere else on the next album, the next performance, the next impossible standard he set for himself. Sherry tried to understand. She really did. But loving someone the entire world wanted meant sharing him with millions of people who'd never met him, but felt like they owned a piece of his soul. In 1984, Perry released his first solo single, Oh Sherry. The song was a love letter and an apology rolled into one. He poured their entire story into those lyrics, the passion, the distance, the desperate hope they could make it work. The music video showed them together, smiling, happy. Behind the scenes, they were already falling apart. Sherry later reflected in a rare interview. Being with Steve was like holding on to lightning. Beautiful, powerful, but impossible to keep. The fame had built a wall between them that no amount of love could break down. By 1986, their relationship ended. No dramatic fight, no public scandal. Just two people who loved each other but couldn't bridge the gap between his world and hers. Perry never fully recovered from losing her. Friends noticed the change immediately. The light in his eyes dimmed. His smile became something he wore instead of felt. He kept performing, kept recording, but something essential was missing. Jonathan Cain, Journey's keyboardist, wrote faithfully in 1983 about the loneliness of life on the road. But when Perry sang it, the lyrics transformed into something deeply personal. Every word about distance, devotion, and staying true felt like he was singing directly to Sherry. I'm forever yours, faithfully. That line haunted him for decades, because even after she was gone, even after years of silence, part of Steve Perry was still waiting for her to come back. And that's the heartbreak he carried into every performance, until he couldn't perform anymore. The long silence. After Journey's Raised on Radio tour in 1987, Steve Perry did something nobody expected. He disappeared press release. No farewell concert. He just stopped. The band tried to reach him. Fans demanded answers, but Perry had already made his choice. He walked away from the biggest band in rock music and never looked back. The last show was in Anchorage, Alaska, on February 1st, 1987. Perry walked off stage, packed his bags, and within weeks, he was gone. Phone calls went unanswered. Letters sat unopened. The man who'd spent a decade in the spotlight vanished into thin air. People speculated endlessly. Was it his voice? Was it creative differences? Industry insiders whispered about hip surgery he'd needed. Others claimed the band was falling apart from the inside. The truth was simpler and sadder. Steve Perry was exhausted from being Steve Perry. For more than 20 years, he lived like a ghost of himself. He moved between small towns where people didn't recognize him. He avoided music entirely. Couldn't listen to Journey songs on the radio. Couldn't watch old performances. Every note reminded him of everything he'd lost. Once, a friend invited him to dinner, and Don't Stop Believin' played in the restaurant. Perry stood up immediately and walked outside. He waited in the parking lot until the song ended. His friend found him leaning against a car, eyes closed, breathing slowly. He later admitted, "I had this PTSD thing with music. Hearing my own voice felt like torture because it brought back all the pain. The voice that once brought joy to millions now brought him nothing but heartache." Each melody carried memories he wasn't ready to face. Sherry's smile, the exhaustion of touring, the impossible standards, the person he'd become and hated. Friends worried. The family tried to help. But Perry had built walls so high that nobody could reach him. He convinced himself that silence was safer than facing what the music represented: the broken relationship, the abandoned dreams, the version of himself he could never be again. His mother called weekly, begging him to just hum something, anything. "You were born to sing," she'd say. Perry would smile sadly and change the subject. Even she couldn't break through the fortress he'd built around his heart. During those quiet years, Perry lived simply. He took long walks through parks and nature trails, read books for hours in coffee shops, avoided crowds and public spaces where someone might recognize him. He grew a beard, wore regular clothes, and became invisible. People who spotted him said he seemed peaceful but distant, like someone watching life happen instead of living it. A grocery store clerk in a small Northern California town once recognized him. "Are you?" she started to ask. Perry just shook his head gently and kept walking. He attended a few Journey concerts in secret, standing in the back of arenas, watching his replacement sing the songs he'd written. Instead of anger, he felt relief. Someone else carried that burden now. Someone else dealt with the expectations. The years turned into decades. 1990 became 2000. Perry aged in silence. His hair turned gray. Lines appeared on his face. The world moved on, and so did he, or at least he tried to. The promise that changed everything. In 2011, Steve Perry's world shifted again. He met Dr. Kelly Nash, a psychologist and breast cancer survivor, at a support group. She was strong, compassionate, and completely unimpressed by his fame. Kelly didn't ask about Journey. She didn't request autographs or push him to sing. She just wanted to know him, the real him. And slowly, carefully, Perry let her in. They fell in love in a way that felt different from everything before. There was no tour schedule to interrupt them. No screaming fans pulling him in different directions, just two people finding comfort in each other's presence. Perry later said, "Kelly made me remember what it felt like to be myself. Not the voice, not the performer, just Steve." For the first time in decades, he started humming again. Not performing, just letting music exist naturally in his life. Kelly would catch him singing softly while cooking dinner or tapping rhythms on the steering wheel, and she'd smile without saying a word. But their time together was cruelly short. Kelly's cancer returned, aggressive and unforgiving. As her health declined, she told Perry something that would echo in his mind for years. "Don't disappear again," she said, her voice weak but determined. "Promise me you'll sing. Promise me you won't hide anymore." Perry held her hand and promised, even though he didn't know if he could keep that promise. When Kelly passed in December 2012, Perry's world collapsed. The silence he'd lived with for so long became deafening. But this time, instead of running from the pain, something inside him shifted. One quiet afternoon, sitting in his home, Perry did something he'd avoided for 25 years. He walked to his old record collection and pulled out a Journey album. His hand shook as he placed it on the turntable. The needle dropped. The first piano notes of Faithfully filled the room, and Steve Perry broke down completely. The comeback nobody expected. In 2018, the song that broke him. Hearing Faithfully again wasn't like listening to an old song. It was like opening a door to every memory he'd locked away. Perry sat frozen in his living room chair as his younger voice sang through the speakers. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting shadows across the floor. He'd meant to just listen for a few seconds to test himself, see if he could handle it. But the moment those opening piano notes filled the room, his body refused to move. Every word hits differently now. The lyrics about being on the road, about circus life, about staying faithful despite the distance, they weren't just about touring anymore. They were about Sherry, about Kelly, about every person he'd ever loved and lost, about the years he spent hiding from the very thing that made him feel alive. Jonathan Cain had written those lyrics in 1983 on a tour bus between cities. He'd captured the loneliness of life on the road perfectly. But when Perry first sang them, he'd transformed them into something deeper, a confession about love surviving distance. Now, decades later, those same words carried entirely different weight. Highway Run into the Midnight Sun. His younger voice sang with such confidence, such certainty. Perry remembered recording that vocal take. Third try, he'd nailed it perfectly, and everyone in the studio had applauded. But that confidence was gone now. That certainty had disappeared somewhere between 1987 and this quiet afternoon in 2014. "I'm forever yours, faithfully." That line shattered him completely, because at 69 years old, sitting alone in his house, Perry realized he'd been faithful to the wrong things. Faithful to fear, faithful to silence, faithful to a version of protection that had really just been prison. Tears streamed down his face. His shoulders shook. The voice on the recording, so powerful, so confident, felt like it belonged to a stranger, but it was him. The him who used to believe music could heal anything. The him who poured his heart into every performance. The him who loved Sherry Swafford with everything he had. Where did that person go? When did the music become something to fear instead of embrace? Perry tried to wipe his eyes, but the tears kept coming. Each verse brought new memories flooding back stadium lights. Sherry's face in the crowd, Kelly's hand in his, the weight of expectations, the joy of creation, the pain of perfection. The song reached its climax. His voice soared on the recording, hitting notes he wasn't sure he could reach anymore. And something inside him broke open, not in a destructive way, but like a dam, finally releasing decades of held-back emotion. Perry later described that moment. "I'd spent decades running from that song. When I finally let myself hear it, I didn't just remember the past. I felt it. Every choice, every heartbreak, every reason I walked away." The song ended. Silence filled the room again, but this silence felt different. Not empty, but full of possibility. Perry sat there for several minutes, his breathing slowly returning to normal. His face was wet, His chest ached. But something else stirred beneath the pain, something he hadn't felt in 27 years. Hope. But something else happened in that moment of breaking. A tiny spark ignited. Kelly's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't disappear again." Those words, spoken from her hospital bed months before she died, had haunted him. He'd promised her. And suddenly, sitting in that room with tears still wet on his face, Perry understood what that promise really meant. It wasn't about becoming famous again. It wasn't about rejoining Journey or selling out arenas. It was about letting music back into his life. Not as a burden, but as a gift. Perry stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. He walked across the room to his piano, a beautiful instrument that had sat untouched for years, gathering dust. He lifted the cover, revealing the keys. His hand trembled as he reached toward them. How long had it been? How many years since he'd created music instead of running from it? He placed his fingers on the keys. They felt foreign and familiar at the same time. Cold ivory beneath warm skin. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath years of fear. He pressed down gently, and the sound that emerged wasn't perfect. It was uncertain, trembling, raw. But it was alive. That single note hung in the air, beautiful in its imperfection. Perry pressed another key, then another. Simple melody, nothing complex, just sound flowing from his fingers for the first time in decades. More tears came, but these felt different. Not tears of pain, but release. That single moment, fingers on piano keys, tears on his face, was the beginning of Steve Perry coming home to himself. The music world received shocking news. Steve Perry was releasing new music. After 24 years of silence, the voice that defined an era was returning. The album was called Traces, and it wasn't what anyone expected. No arena rock anthems, no soaring high notes meant to impress. Just honest, vulnerable songs about love, loss, and learning to live again. Critics praised the craftsmanship, but fans heard something deeper. They heard a man who'd survived his own story and came out the other side still standing. In interviews, Perry looked different. Older, silver-haired, wearing glasses. But his eyes carried something they hadn't before peace. "I didn't come back because I missed the stage," he told one interviewer. "I came back because I missed feeling alive." The album featured songs like No Erasing and No More Cryin', each one carrying the weight of his journey. His voice had changed, softer in places, weathered by time, but somehow that made it more powerful. This wasn't the voice of perfection. It was the voice of truth. When journalists asked about his time away, Perry didn't dodge the question. Those years weren't wasted. I needed every single one of them to become who I am now. Fans who'd waited decades for his return didn't just welcome him back, they celebrated his honesty. Social media is flooded with messages of support. People shared how his music had carried them through their own dark times, and now they wanted to return that support. Perry made a few small appearances, including a surprise visit to a Journey concert. He didn't perform. He stood in the crowd, just another face in the audience, and watched fans sing the words he'd written decades ago. Later, he said watching that moment moved him to tears all over again. Hearing thousands of people sing those lyrics back reminded me why I did this in the first place. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being true. The legacy of Faithfully. Today, Faithfully means something different than it did in 1983. Back then, it was a hit song about life on the road. Now, it's a testament to endurance to stay loyal to yourself, even when everything falls apart. Steve Perry's journey taught millions of people a powerful lesson. Walking away isn't always a weakness. Sometimes it's survival. And coming back isn't about reclaiming glory. It's about honoring what you left behind. At 75 years old now, Perry rarely performs. But when he does speak publicly, his words carry wisdom earned through decades of silence and struggle. "People ask if I regret leaving," he said in a recent interview. "I don't. That silence saved my life. It gave me space to heal, to remember who I was before the world told me who to be." The tears he cried listening to "Faithfully" weren't weakness, they were released. Permission to finally let go of the pain he'd carried for so long. And that's the real story here. Not about a comeback or a legendary voice returning. It's about a man who got lost in his own life and found his way back through the very thing that broke him. Music didn't destroy Steve Perry. Fame did. Expectations did. The weight of being perfect did. But the music, that song he'd avoided for 25 years, also saved him. Steve Perry's story reminds us that healing isn't linear. It's messy, painful, and often takes longer than we expect, but it's also possible. The voice that once filled stadiums now fills something more important, his own heart. And maybe that's the greatest success any artist can achieve. "Faithfully" will always be Journey's song. But it's also Steve Perry's story, a reminder that staying true to yourself is the hardest and most important thing you'll ever do. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to step back, to heal, to return when you're ready. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about the people behind the music, the struggles, the comebacks, the moments that define us. Drop a comment below. What song has a similar meaning in your life? What music helped you through your darkest times? Steve Perry proved that you can disappear for decades and still come back stronger. Not louder, not more famous, just more yourself. And sometimes, that's exactly what the world needs to hear. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay faithful to your own journey.